Something extraordinary just happened, and Vladimir Putin, the man who has spent 4 years telling the world that Russia is winning, the man whose state media has told Russian citizens every single morning that their soldiers are advancing, that their economy is strong, that their nation is untouchable, just admitted on camera in front of the entire world that Ukraine's attacks are damaging the Russian economy and Russian society, not slightly, not in some minor technical sense that politicians use to dodge accountability, but in a real, undeniable, economy-shaking way that even the most powerful propaganda machine on earth could no longer conceal. And this admission did not come from a Western analyst. It did not come from a Ukrainian official. It did not come from a NATO press conference. It came directly from Vladimir Putin himself, the same man who launched this war calling it a special military operation, the same man who told his generals it would be finished in 72 hours, the same man who has spent 4 years insisting that Russia cannot be broken. And now in June 2026, he is standing in front of cameras with the weight of that contradiction visible on his face, admitting that Ukraine is hitting targets over 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory, oil refineries, fuel depots, critical pipelines, and he cannot stop it, he cannot explain it away, and he cannot hide it anymore. On June 12, 2026, Putin made a statement that sent shockwaves through every intelligence agency, every defense ministry, and every geopolitical analyst tracking this conflict, because he publicly acknowledged that Ukraine's recent wave of deep strikes is inflicting real, measurable damage on the Russian economy and on Russian society as a whole. And these were not words twisted out of context by Western journalists. These were not translations with hidden meanings. These were direct, on-the-record admissions spoken by the President of the Russian Federation in front of cameras. And the reason this matters so profoundly is that Putin has spent 4 years constructing an information fortress around the Russian public, with state television running victory narratives 24 hours a day, with independent journalists imprisoned or exiled, with social media platforms blocked, with the word war itself banned and replaced with the phrase special military operation. And in one press conference, in one unscripted moment of admission, Putin took a sledgehammer to that fortress wall, because when the president of Russia says the economy is being damaged by enemy strikes, every Russian citizen who hears those words starts doing math they were never supposed to do, starts asking questions the Kremlin was never supposed to face, and starts understanding that the war their government told them was going perfectly is in fact costing them something real. Since the beginning of 2026, Ukrainian forces have executed a remarkable and historically significant campaign of deep strikes against Russian military plants and energy infrastructure, and the scale of what Ukraine has accomplished is difficult to overstate. These strikes are reaching targets located more than 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, which to put in perspective is roughly the distance from London to Berlin, meaning Ukraine is not just fighting the Russians occupying its territory, but is reaching deep into the Russian heartland and hitting the economic arteries that keep Putin's war machine alive, targeting refineries in Nizhnekamsk that process millions of barrels of oil destined for export, hitting fuel depots that supply Russian-occupied Crimea and the Russian military units stationed there, striking pipelines that carry the natural gas and oil exports that generate the billions of dollars Russia needs every single month to pay its soldiers, fund its weapons factories, and sustain an economy that Western sanctions were designed to strangle but could not fully break. And the truly remarkable part is that Russia's celebrated air defense systems, the S-300s and S-400s that Moscow has spent decades marketing to the world as impenetrable shields, cannot stop these Ukrainian strikes, cannot intercept enough of them to prevent the damage, and cannot protect the infrastructure that Putin's entire war strategy depends upon. Now here is the part that the mainstream media is not explaining clearly enough, and this is the critical insight that changes everything about how you should understand this war. Russia's military campaign in Ukraine is not funded by taxes. It is not funded by bonds. It is not funded by the kind of diverse economic base that Western nations use to finance their defense budgets. It is funded almost entirely by oil and gas revenue, which means that every missile Putin fires at a Ukrainian city, every drone that crashes into a Ukrainian apartment building, every tank that rolls across the front line, every soldier who receives a paycheck, every weapons factory running a night shift, all of it, every single element of Russia's war machine is paid for by the money that flows from Russian oil refineries and natural gas pipelines into the Kremlin's budget. And Ukraine has understood this with a clarity and strategic sophistication that has surprised even its Western allies. Which is why Ukraine is not just fighting a conventional military war, but is simultaneously waging an economic war designed to drain the financial engine that makes conventional warfare possible for Russia. And the evidence that this strategy is working came directly from Putin's own mouth on June 12th, when he admitted that the strikes are hurting the economy and hurting society, which is the equivalent of a general admitting in public that his supply lines are being cut. But there is a dimension to what is happening inside Russia right now that goes even deeper than the economic damage, and it is the political and psychological dimension that may ultimately prove more consequential than any battlefield development. Ukraine has triggered the worst fuel crisis in Crimea since Russia illegally seized the peninsula in 2014, with ordinary Russian citizens and military personnel in the occupied territory lining up at petrol stations in Simferopol because fuel trucks are being intercepted and destroyed by Ukrainian strikes before they can reach their destinations. And this means that Russia, a nation sitting on some of the largest proven oil and gas reserves on the planet, a nation that has built its entire national identity around energy wealth and resource abundance, is now rationing fuel in territory it controls and occupies, and the symbolism of that reality, the sheer humiliation of it, is not lost on the Russian military commanders trying to keep their vehicles fueled, on the Russian officials trying to maintain the appearance of normal life in occupied Crimea, or on the Russian citizens watching the gap between what their government tells them and what they can see with their own eyes growing wider every week. Putin's admission is therefore not just an economic confession. It is a political earthquake inside the Kremlin, because the entire architecture of Putin's domestic authority rests on the perception of strength, competence, and inevitability. And when a leader who has constructed his public image entirely around those qualities is forced to publicly acknowledge that a smaller, less resourced neighbor is successfully hitting targets 1,000 kilometers inside his country and damaging his economy, the message that sends through every level of Russian society is devastating, with military generals questioning the strategy, with oligarchs calculating their exposure, with ordinary Russians doing the forbidden arithmetic of comparing what they were promised with what they are experiencing, and all of them arriving at the same terrifying question. If Ukraine can reach oil refineries 1,000 kilometers inside Russia today, what will Ukraine be able to reach tomorrow? The battlefield picture confirms everything the economic picture suggests. Russia's military has been unable to make meaningful advances during the first 5 months of 2026, and according to analysts at leading Western defense institutes, the Russian military may actually have ended May 2026, holding less territory than it held in April, which is an almost incomprehensible outcome given that Russia has committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to this conflict, has spent what independent economists estimate to be hundreds of billions of dollars, and has sacrificed equipment, personnel, and international standing on a scale not seen in Europe since the Second World War. And the reason Russia cannot advance is directly connected to what Ukraine has built, a drone-based defensive architecture that now creates a kill zone extending more than 10 kilometers beyond the formal front lines, a zone where Russian armored columns, troop concentrations, and supply convoys are identified, tracked, and destroyed with a speed and precision that has made large-scale ground offensives prohibitively costly. And this is why Putin has abandoned the ground war strategy and shifted to mass aerial bombardment of Ukrainian cities, launching on the night of June 2, 2026, one of the single largest aerial attacks of the entire conflict, with 650 attack drones and more than 32 cruise and ballistic missiles aimed not at military targets, but at civilian apartment buildings in Kyiv, at a kindergarten in the Obolonsky district, at a medical clinic in the Holosivsky district, at residential towers across multiple districts of the Ukrainian capital. And the reason Putin is doing this is not because it advances any military objective, but because he has run out of military options on the ground and is now attempting to break Ukrainian civilian morale through terror, which is the strategy of a commander who has lost the initiative and knows it. Looking ahead, there are 3 possible trajectories for this conflict over the next 60 days, and understanding each one is essential for grasping where this war is actually heading. The first trajectory is continued Russian escalation through mass aerial attacks on Ukrainian cities, which Putin has explicitly promised, but the fundamental problem with this approach is that Ukraine has spent 4 years building and expanding its air defense network with Western assistance, and that network is intercepting an increasing percentage of incoming Russian missiles and drones, while each failed Russian strike represents a financial cost that Russia is finding increasingly difficult to absorb given the damage Ukraine has already done to its energy revenue. The second trajectory is a Russian move toward ceasefire negotiations, which Putin has signaled interest in while simultaneously attaching conditions that no Ukrainian government could accept without political suicide. Because any ceasefire agreement that leaves Russian forces on Ukrainian territory does not end the war. It merely pauses it while Russia rearms, regroups, and prepares the next offensive. And both Ukraine and its NATO allies understand this clearly enough that genuine ceasefire negotiations remain distant. The third trajectory, the one that keeps European defense ministers and NATO planners awake at night, is a Russian escalation designed not to win the conventional war, but to shock the West into abandoning Ukraine, through a strike on a NATO logistics hub supplying weapons to Kyiv, through a military move against a Baltic state designed to test Article 5, or through a nuclear demonstration intended to signal that Putin is willing to cross lines that Western leaders have assumed he would never cross. And while the probability of this trajectory remains low, it is not negligible, and it is the scenario that every serious defense analyst is building contingency plans around. My assessment, based on everything the evidence shows, is that the most probable path through the remainder of 2026 involves Ukraine continuing and intensifying its deep strike campaign against Russian energy and military infrastructure, Russia responding with sustained aerial bombardment of Ukrainian cities that inflicts suffering but fails to break Ukrainian resolve, the front lines remaining largely static with neither side capable of a decisive breakthrough, and the political and economic pressure on the Kremlin continuing to build in ways that Putin's propaganda apparatus is increasingly unable to conceal from the Russian public. Here is the bottom line that cuts through everything. When the leader of a nation that has invested 40 years in projecting an image of military invincibility and economic resilience is forced to stand before cameras and admit that a smaller neighbor is successfully attacking his country's economic infrastructure and damaging his society, that is not a routine press conference moment. That is a historic admission of strategic failure, and the question that should be on every observer's mind is no longer whether Ukraine can survive this war, but whether the Russian state as Putin has constructed it can survive the combination of military stalemate, economic attrition, and political pressure that Ukraine and its allies are now applying simultaneously. Subscribe right now, because this story is moving fast, and the next development could change everything we think we know about how this war ends.